Hey there. Welcome to our channel Sleeping Pill, where stories drift softly into the night. I'm Michael, your companion on this slow journey into sleep. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let this gentle story carry you towards sleep. Tonight we are diving into a life built on a tiny, almost imperceptible lie. The story of you, the beautifully dependable school teacher, and the man you married by perfectly respectable mistake. Picture this opening scene. You are sitting in a slightly overheated, moderately popular artisanal coffee shop, nervously stirring a lavender latte that you immediately regret ordering. You are on a first date with Arthur. The air smells like burnt sugar and profound commitment issues, but you ignore the latter because Arthur is wearing a perfectly ironed Oxford shirt and seems to possess a soothing, low baritone voice. You, the meticulous fourth grade school teacher, are running through your usual mental checklist. Does he make eye contact? Yes. Does he remember the name of your cat? Yes, he mentioned Barnaby 3 times. Is he a writer? Yes, he is. This is where the quiet lie begins, in the low light, filtering through the vintage stained glass window. Arthur says, "I'm a writer." You hear, "I am an author, probably working on a dense, meaningful novel that will require me to be deep and brooding." You immediately feel a little flutter, imagining yourself as the muse to a literary genius. You ask the crucial, predictable question, "Oh, wow. What do you write?" And Arthur, the man who will soon be your spouse, responds with exquisite vagueness. Various things. A lot of long-form projects, mostly nonfiction, very specialized. He then quickly changes the subject to the surprising complexity of the artisanal coffee bean sourcing, an area of expertise he clearly prepared for. You nod sagely, filing his answer under mysterious, high-concept novelist stuff. You imagine him hunched over a heavy antique desk, wrestling with metaphors and character arcs. You imagine long, romantic nights of him reading profound draft chapters to you by firelight. You mentally cross off "has a stable career" on your checklist, substituting it with the more exciting, creative genius who needs my structure. You probably won't survive this level of romantic projection based on less than 8 vague words. He wasn't, of course, writing a high-concept novel. He was writing corporate white papers, CEO memoirs, and endless batches of clickbait listicles for a content farm. Arthur was a professional ghostwriter, a purveyor of expertly crafted, utterly invisible prose. His job was to assume the voice of other people, often people who had very boring stories, but very large platforms. He was the literary equivalent of a competent HVAC technician, essential, highly skilled, and completely uncredited. But how could you, the school teacher who deals in the concrete world of grammar rules and glitter glue, ever guess this? The term writer felt like an open-ended promise, and you, bless your organized heart, immediately filled the blank with the most glamorous literary possibility. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. It helps me feel connected across the miles. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The date ends pleasantly. You walk away thinking you've met a future literary star. Arthur walks away relieved you didn't ask for a title or a publisher's name and mentally checks achieved human connection off his own, slightly different. checklist. The quiet deception you bought into on that first date, the idea of marrying a profound novelist, was fueled entirely by Arthur's masterful skill at saying everything while conveying nothing. Your relationship progressed with the comfortable rhythm of two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Yet the subject of the novelist and his mysterious work remained cloaked in an air of deliberate, if gentle, secrecy. You would ask about his day, and his responses were always beautifully vague, almost perfectly sculpted to fit your romantic projection of a man wrestling with literary titans. "How is work?" you'd inquire as you meticulously graded a stack of fourth-grade papers on the proper use of semicolons. Arthur sitting across from you at the kitchen table, which was ironically the central location of both your highly visible, structured chaos and his highly invisible, structured calm, would sigh dramatically, run a hand through his hair and say, "Exhausting. I spent 6 hours fighting the internal monologue of the protagonist. He's struggling with existential dread. What you heard, my brilliant hero is questioning the nature of reality. What was actually happening? Arthur had spent 6 hours attempting to inject a passable level of existential dread into the memoir of a mid-level tech CEO whose main concern was the Q3 sales figures for his proprietary line of ergonomic office chairs. The CEO's original draft, you would later learn, consisted mostly of bullet points and aggressive exclamation marks. Arthur's job was to make the CEO sound like a thoughtful, slightly haunted visionary. You see, the ghostwriter's craft is built on invisibility and plausible deniability. And Arthur was a master. He never actually lied. He simply allowed you to connect the dots in the most flattering way possible. When you asked if he had a deadline, he'd say, "The demands of the publisher are relentless," which was true. His client's publisher was indeed relentless. When you asked about his earnings, he'd merely raise an eyebrow and say, "It's feast or famine in this industry," which was also true, as he was either buried under a 50,000-word corporate history of fertilizer production feast, or waiting for the next tech guru to decide they needed a self-help book based on their morning routine. Famine. His work habits, however, should have been your first clue. Your idea of a novelist was someone who paced the floor, threw crumpled paper into a bin, and occasionally wept over a beautifully crafted sentence. Arthur's process was disturbingly smooth. He would sit down at his laptop at 8:30 a.m., wear noise-canceling headphones, and type steadily, almost rhythmically, until 5 p.m. No pacing, no dramatic outbursts, just the calm, relentless tap, tap, tap of a man executing a contract. It was the productivity of an accountant, not an artist. You, meanwhile, spent your after-school hours frantically organizing construction paper, trying to find your stapler, and occasionally having minor breakdowns over the correct way to spell schedule. Your life was visible, physical, and loud. His was silent, digital, and utterly masked. One evening you decided to gently press him further. "Do you ever get tired?" you asked sweetly, "of all that profound introspection? Do you ever just want to write something fun?" Arthur paused his steady typing, looked up, and gave you a rare, genuine smile. "I'm currently writing a motivational self-help book that compares successful business practices to the migratory patterns of Canadian geese," he admitted. He didn't say who it was for. You laughed, delighted by his wry, satirical humor, Thinking he was just being ironic, you probably should have noted the extremely detailed folder on his desktop labeled Geese, Migration, and Metaphors. That should have been your first red flag, but your teacher's heart was already too invested in his artistic struggle. The progression from vague professional claims to life partnership was seamless, much like a perfectly crafted transition paragraph in one of Arthur's uncredited business blogs. The ambiguity around his work, far from being a problem, became a comfortable fixture, an eccentricity you filed under creative temperament. Then came the proposal, and like everything else in your relationship, it was low-key, sweet, and entirely lacking in the dramatic, sweeping gestures that fictional novelists might attempt. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. You were both in the kitchen, engaged in the highly complex, slightly competitive task of organizing your new pantry. You, the school teacher, were focused on the precise, alphabetical and categorical order of your baking supplies. All-purpose flour followed by almond meal, then baking powder. Arthur, the ghostwriter, was responsible for the spices. He was holding a slightly sticky jar of paprika, staring at it with the intense concentration he usually reserved for crafting the authentic voice of a minor social media influencer. "You know," Arthur mumbled without looking up from the paprika, "we should probably invest in one of those tiered spice racks. It would really optimize the use of vertical space." You were placing the cumin next to the coriander, trying to decide if the alphabetical order should trump the proximity of flavor profiles. "Maybe," you replied, counting the jars, "but we'd have to make a commitment." "Those things are bolted to the wall." He finally looked up, his eyes a little unfocused from his deep dive into shelf architecture. He held the paprika jar loosely. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that we should make a commitment that is significantly larger than a tiered spice rack, like forever." You paused, your hand hovering over the oregano. It took you a beat to realize what he was actually saying. There was no bended knee, no sparkling ring box, no carefully rehearsed speech. Just Arthur, standing there in a perfectly clean t-shirt, illuminated by the cold light of the opened pantry, holding a jar of slightly dusty paprika. "Are you asking me to marry you?" you asked, perhaps a little too directly, in the tone you used to remind a fourth grader to use a capital letter at the start of a sentence. "Yeah," he confirmed, shrugging slightly. "I am. We work well together. And frankly, this pantry organization is going to take both of us." You laughed, a genuine, delighted sound. It was the least dramatic, most Arthur proposal imaginable. You loved it. It spoke to the reliable, slightly boring compatibility you shared. You said yes, of course. He put the paprika back next to the chili powder, completely ruining your alphabetical flow, and then kissed you, which at least was perfectly romantic. The ring, which he quickly retrieved from his jeans pocket, was elegant and simple. You later learned he had spent 3 months meticulously researching the optimum cut-to-clarity ratio before purchasing it, treating the endeavor with the same methodical precision he used to craft a high-impact executive summary. You didn't marry a brooding poet. You married a highly efficient, detail-oriented project manager who happened to use words instead of spreadsheets. You joked later that your wedding hashtag should be #. She said yes to organizational efficiency. You realized that the proposal scene itself, you two negotiating space and category, was the perfect metaphor for your life together. Two highly structured, slightly rigid people who found perfect harmony in the mundane. You think the novelist might have written me a dramatic love scene, but the ghostwriter just built us a really solid home. And honestly, in the long run, the solid home wins every time. You immediately started planning the wedding, an event that, thanks to your organizational skills, was slated to be a model of impeccable planning, much like a perfectly edited corporate biography. After the paprika-scented proposal, the wedding planning, masterminded by your innate ability to organize large-scale logistical nightmares, a necessary skill for managing 44th graders, proceeded flawlessly. This stability was crucial because it provided a rock-solid foundation against which you could measure the beautiful, invisible oddities of Arthur's daily existence. This was the era of the teacher's routine against his hidden life. Your life, the life of a dedicated school teacher, was a symphony of rigid public chaos. Your mornings started with the frantic smell of burnt toast and the desperate search for the one administrative form you knew you'd left on the kitchen counter. You dealt with loud physical realities, the squeak of dry erase markers, the sticky resistance of glitter glue, the sheer exhausting volume of 40 small voices discussing the merits of different cartoon characters. Your day was dictated by bells, timetables, and the ironclad rules of curriculum. When you came home, you carried the physical residue of your career, chalk dust on your trousers, a faint, lingering smell of disinfectant, and the emotional weight of convincing a small, reluctant child that subtraction was a worthwhile skill. Arthur's life, meanwhile, was the precise opposite: silent, digital, and utterly concealed. While you were commanding a classroom, struggling to explain the difference between there and there, Arthur was sitting at his home office desk, bathed in the cool glow of his monitor, crafting prose for people whose faces you'd never see. His chaos was internal, a fight against cliches and bad corporate branding. His day was dictated not by a bell, but by the relentless, invisible demands of his client's tone of voice. You'd come home exhausted, ready to vent about the 5th grade teacher stealing your laminator, and Arthur would emerge from his office, looking perfectly composed, having just successfully finished a 10,000-word ebook about harnessing the power of synergy in vertical farming. You'd ask him about his day, and he'd use those beautifully vague terms again. It was a difficult day, he'd say, massaging his temples. I had to nail the voice of a truly cynical narrator, but keep the underlying message optimistic. You would again interpret this as a profound artistic struggle. The truth was, he was struggling to make a cynical venture capitalist sound like he genuinely cared about the environment while simultaneously pitching an aggressive seed funding round. It was less Dostoevsky, more deceptive advertising. The most striking contrast was the noise level. You lived in a world of unavoidable sound. Arthur lived in a world of curated silence. You'd open his office door, and he'd be wearing the heavy, noise-canceling headphones, typing with that unnerving, clockwork rhythm. The only sound was the whisper of the keys, a ghost writing in the digital air. You'd look at his screen, and it would be filled with blocks of text, clean, perfect, and utterly devoid of his own personality. You realized his entire job was to become a literary phantom, and he was excellent at it. You, by contrast, couldn't go 5 minutes without a student recognizing your voice in the supermarket. The great irony was that the person who dealt in the most fictional narratives was Arthur, the ghostwriter, and the person who dealt in the most unvarnished reality was you, the school teacher. You had to convince children that 2 + 2 = 4, a non-negotiable truth. Arthur had to convince adults that their mundane business practices were actually a revolutionary philosophy worthy of a leather-bound book. You were teaching reality. He was selling polished fantasy. And yet this perfectly mismatched professional arrangement provided a foundation of stability. You brought structure, and he brought the highly organized income that paid the mortgage. The wedding day arrived, an immaculately organized triumph of your planning skills. Every napkin was folded precisely. Every vendor was on time, and every single 4th grade parent you invited remarked on your impressive attention to detail. Yet, even amidst the perfectly orchestrated floral arrangements and the slightly over-rehearsed first dance, the quiet, fundamental deception of Arthur's career cast a shadow of dramatic wedding day irony. The irony, of course, centered around Arthur's parents. They were delightful, proud people who had, over the course of your engagement, entirely bought into the narrative of their son, the novelist. They had read your earnest enthusiasm and Arthur's artful vagueness and synthesized it into a picture of a man on the cusp of literary greatness. You overhear this belief being reinforced relentlessly throughout the reception. During the cocktail hour, Arthur's Uncle Greg cornered you, drink in hand. "So tell me about the big book deal," he boomed, gesturing enthusiastically toward Arthur, who was busy trying to discreetly untangle a piece of ribbon from a small child's shoe. "Arthur tells me it's top secret high concept stuff. A real breakthrough." You smiled weakly, remembering Arthur's last breakthrough was successfully getting a client to agree to use the phrase leveraging synergies only 3 times in a 2,000-word piece. The highest point of absurdity was the toast given by Arthur's father, a kindly man who truly believed his son was destined for the bestseller list. He stood up, cleared his throat, and launched into a heartfelt tribute that focused almost entirely on Arthur's supposed fictional book deal. "We are so proud of Arthur," his father declared to the assembled guests, the microphone squealing slightly in protest. "He has worked tirelessly on his manuscript, wrestling with these big, important themes. He can't tell us the title yet. It's all hush-hush. The publisher's protecting his intellectual property, but we know it's going to be huge. A deeply philosophical nonfiction book that will redefine the genre." You gripped Arthur's hand under the table, your knuckles white. What his father was actually describing was the 3-part corporate memoir Arthur had been tasked to write for a motivational speaker whose entire philosophy revolved around the concept of manifesting abundance through aggressive upselling. The hush-hush part was merely the ironclad non-disclosure agreement, NDA, Arthur had signed, which stipulated he could never, under pain of severe financial penalty, admit to writing the garbage. Arthur, to his credit, just offered a small, mysterious smile and raised his glass in silent acknowledgement, perfecting his role as the brooding, secretive genius. You almost choked on your champagne, trying to suppress the hysterical laughter bubbling up in your chest. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. Your wedding day, the pinnacle of public declaration and truth, was built atop a beautiful, complex house of literary cards. You had married the only person in the room who had to remain professionally invisible. You look around the room at the smiling faces, all nodding sagely at the promise of Arthur's non-existent magnum opus. You realize that your school teacher's life, with its mandatory transparency and public accountability, will always be the perfect camouflage for his ghostly existence. You, the woman who spends her days teaching the absolute truth of times tables, have now cemented a life with the man who earns his living, selling meticulously crafted lies. And it was fine. It was more than fine. It was a testament to the fact that love, in its boring, enduring form, means accepting and loving the secret, absurd reality behind the polished facade. You lean into Arthur and whisper, "You owe me a great anecdote about the cuckoo clock in the next CEO biography you write." He just squeezed your hand, his eyes twinkling with the subtle mischief of a professional confidence man. Life after the wedding settled into a comfortable, almost shared silence, a strange rhythm established by the radically different yet complementary nature of your professions. The irony was profound. You, the teacher, spent your entire day managing noise, and Arthur, the ghostwriter, spent his entire day managing quiet. Your lives intersected every afternoon at 5 p.m., a transition as sudden as the final bell in your 4th grade classroom. You would return home, your ears ringing slightly from the day's required volume, your mind buzzing with the visible chaos of 57 unreturned permission slips. Arthur would emerge from his home office, looking refreshed and slightly pale from the lack of natural sunlight, having just completed a detailed 4,000-word analysis on the future of sustainable logistics. The quiet lie, remember, was that Arthur was working on his novel. The practical reality was that your home was a co-working space where two people were engaged in radically different forms of communication. You would sit at the kitchen table furiously grading papers, red pen flashing like a warning signal, marking down children who dared to confuse affect and effect, a visible, righteous dedication to linguistic truth. Arthur would sit at the same table, often just reading something on a screen, his headphones off, enjoying the post-deadline calm. The silence was strange. You had married the man who excelled at crafting internal monologues, yet your conversations were often simple logistical updates. "Did you remember to order the printer toner?" you'd ask, still marking a student's essay on ancient Greece. "Yes, and I paid the electric bill," Arthur would reply before adding vaguely, "My protagonist is finally making a major decision." He would not elaborate, and you would not press, filing it all under creative breakthroughs. The true nature of his work was evident in the little things. Sometimes you'd overhear him on a video call before he put his headphones on, and the snippets were always wonderfully absurd. "Yes, Senator," he'd whisper intensely into the microphone. "We need to replace ambitious with pragmatic in the opening statement. It softens the aggressive tone." Or you'd hear him painstakingly recording himself reading a passage aloud in a monotone voice, practicing the cadence of a particularly self-important business guru. He was practicing the art of invisibility, erasing his own voice to perfect another's. You, meanwhile, are constantly visible. Parents stop you in the grocery store to discuss their child's sudden obsession with dinosaurs. Students wave at you from across parking lots. Your identity is public and loud. Arthur could attend his own book launch, the real book he secretly wrote, and no one would recognize him. You often joked, "I feel like I'm living with a highly paid spy, only instead of international intrigue, his mission is to make a podcaster sound smarter." It wasn't a bad life, just a perfectly mismatched, boringly functional one. The shared silence wasn't empty. It was a space where you both recovered from the demands of your respective opposite callings. It was the calm between the fourth grade storm and the storm of a ghostwriter's demanding hidden deadlines. You loved the steady rhythm, realizing that the absence of drama was the love story. The greatest challenge of being married to a ghostwriter is the constant flow of absolutely absurd information that must, by contractual obligation, remain secret. While your teaching life was about verifiable facts, the year the Magna Carta was signed, the chemical composition of water, Arthur's life was about highly polished, strategically fictionalized nonsense, and you were privy to just enough of it to realize the sheer professional absurdity of your husband's existence. This all came to a head when his clients began to demand last-minute calls, meaning you would occasionally hear snippets of absurd, secret, high-profile conversations wafting from his closed office door. Arthur, the master of the low-profile life, was the linguistic architect for the high-profile and often the deeply ridiculous. One day, you are quietly grading a stack of essays on animal habitats, thoroughly enjoying the quiet thwack of your red grading pen. Suddenly you hear Arthur's voice, pitched low and intense, cutting through the thin soundproofing of the wall. No, we can't use journey again, Ms. Sinclair. It's the fourth time on this page. We need to substitute it with a word that conveys forward momentum without sounding too much like movement. How about trajectory? You pause, pen suspended over a misplaced comma, realizing Arthur is spending his afternoon teaching a motivational speaker how to avoid using the word journey too often in her book about overcoming mild organizational challenges. The next day, it's worse. You hear him negotiating the correct level of humility for a former politician's memoir. The public needs to believe he understands the weight of responsibility, Arthur explains patiently. But we need to avoid the word mistake entirely. I suggest we phrase it as an unforeseen outcome stemming from a profoundly noble endeavor. You sink back in your chair, shaking your head, suddenly realizing your husband's entire job is to invent polite euphemisms for failure. You can't help but think about how much easier your life would be if you could just tell a difficult parent their child's behavior was simply an unforeseen outcome stemming from a profoundly noble endeavor to eat glitter glue. The absolute peak of the absurdity came when he spent 3 full days working on the biography of a moderately famous reality television star who was launching a line of branded essential oils. You overheard him on a late-night call, sounding truly exhausted. I understand the need for authenticity, Mr. Jones, but we simply cannot include the passage where you compare the scent of your lavender oil to the existential dread of 1,000 silent Sundays. It's too specific. Let's try a calming aroma that hints at the profound possibilities of the week ahead. You realize the immense intellectual energy Arthur expends daily is not on creating literary art, but on the delicate act of massaging egos with carefully constructed linguistic cotton wool. You, the school teacher, have to deal with the truth that a student can't grasp the concept of fractions. Arthur has to deal with the truth that a business guru can't string two coherent sentences together and then make them sound like a philosopher king. You try to joke about it later, whispering to Arthur over dinner, "Is the trajectory of the profound possibility man going well today?" He just smiles, a tired, knowing smile, and says, "He decided he wants a chapter on how he invented a specific type of knot for his boat shoes. I have to make the knot sound like a life lesson." You look at him, this brilliant, invisible writer, and you can't help but love the honest absurdity of his hidden life, even if you can never tell your teacher friends that your husband is secretly the literary voice behind the world's most earnest essential oil entrepreneur. You realize the true meaning of your boring love story. Two people dedicated to structure, one of you structuring fact, the other structuring compelling, lucrative fiction. The invisible nature of Arthur's work meant that sometimes the only way you could truly gauge the sheer scale of the nonsense he was trafficking was by attending a public event tied to one of his projects. This was never more apparent than during the great book launch. You recall the elaborate invitation, embossed and heavy, for the launch of the mindful metric, Achieving Zen Productivity in Q4, by some wildly successful, impossibly glossy wellness guru whom Arthur had affectionately nicknamed the Abundance Alchemist. You attend the launch party with Arthur, playing the part of the supportive, somewhat aloof spouse of a consultant. This was the latest, slightly grander euphemism Arthur had trained you to use. The venue is painfully chic, filled with people in designer athleisure wear who speak exclusively in capital letters about synergy and vibrational energy. You, the school teacher, feel distinctly out of place in your practical, non-vibration enhancing dress. The irony here is thicker than a badly mixed protein shake. You are here to celebrate a book that Arthur wrote. Every single word, comma, and market-tested motivational anecdote. He crafted the voice, he structured the three-part process, he even came up with the title, making sure it hit all the necessary mindful and metric keywords. Yet he is entirely invisible. You watch as the Abundance Alchemist takes the stage, bathed in flattering spotlights, and delivers a passionate speech about the years of struggle and profound personal discovery that went into writing the mindful metric. Arthur, standing quietly beside you, occasionally sipping a lukewarm glass of sparkling water, offers a look of utterly resigned professionalism. He is the invisible master in a room full of celebrated amateurs. You know that Arthur's profound personal discovery during this project mainly involved figuring out how to make a chapter on spreadsheet optimization sound like a spiritual awakening. You spend the evening trying to avoid conversations with people who ask you deeply probing questions about Arthur's own novel, The One That Doesn't Exist. I hear he's delving into some serious existential themes, one woman purrs, adjusting her enormous geometric glasses. Is it a critique of late-stage capitalism or more of a quiet family saga? You simply smile that professional, vague smile Arthur taught you and say, "It's very long and very, very personal." He's still wrestling with the ending. This is technically true. Arthur is still wrestling with the ending of the Essential Oils biography, trying to land the perfect closing sentence about the profound possibilities of a good night's sleep. You look at the Abundance Alchemist, signing copies of the book with a flourish, soaking up the applause, and you nudge Arthur gently. "It must be strange," you whisper, "to watch someone else get credit for your thoughts." Arthur just shrugs, a gesture of a professional ghost. "It's fine. My thoughts are perfectly aligned with her market strategy. I am merely a highly skilled conduit. Besides," he adds, a flicker of genuine humor in his eyes, "if I got credit for comparing business efficiency to the mating habits of Canadian geese, I'd never be able to teach a grammar lesson again." You realize that this shared, ridiculous secret is a vital part of your boring love story. You, the pillar of visible truth, are the keeper of his invisible fiction. You leave the party, walking past a towering promotional poster of The Abundance Alchemist, feeling a quiet, intense satisfaction. You didn't just attend a book launch, you attended a masterful illusion, and you were the only one there who knew how the trick was done. And that knowledge, that deep, shared absurdity, felt far more intimate than any public declaration of love ever could. The grand illusion of Arthur's work was maintained by the NDAS and the strategic vagueness. But even the best ghostwriter occasionally leaves behind a fingerprint. This happened the week after the highly effective, utterly forgettable launch of the mindful metric, leading to the moment when you accidentally read the manuscript. Arthur had been tasked with polishing the first draft of a celebrity chef's autobiography, a project he clearly dreaded, as it involved extensive research into the spiritual properties of fermentation. One afternoon, while looking for a stapler in his highly organized, noise-dampened office, you spotted an unsecured, unmarked document file open on his screen. It was titled simply Chef's First Attempt. Curiosity, the oldest enemy of the contractually invisible, got the better of you. You sat down and began to scroll. What you read was not merely bad, it was transcendentally, beautifully awful. It was the pure, unfiltered, unedited stream of consciousness of a man who was brilliant with a paring knife, but considered the comma to be an unnecessary obstacle to the flow of genius. The prose was a relentless avalanche of misplaced capital letters, run-on sentences, and breathtakingly arrogant pronouncements. For instance, a simple statement about opening a restaurant was rendered as, "I knew I had to take this leap of faith for the people in the universe. Agreed." The first soup of the day was an accidentally perfect tomato bisque, which proved everything. And the critics, they were like small, annoying insects to my monumental vision. You are a school teacher. Your professional soul is dedicated to the precise logical structure of the English language. This manuscript was the grammatical equivalent of a train derailment. You read a paragraph where the chef described the visceral, almost sexual quality of a perfectly wilted piece of kale, and you actually felt a small, physical wince of pain in your teacherly heart. It wasn't just bad writing. It was the raw, unpolished, embarrassing reality that Arthur was paid exorbitant sums to conceal. You realized that Arthur's real genius wasn't just writing, it was translating garbage into gold-plated mediocrity. He had to take this raw, structurally unsound material and turn it into something that could be legally printed, bound, and sold for $25. You finally understood the intense, quiet rhythm of his typing. He wasn't creating, he was cleaning up. He was a linguistic hazmat specialist, wading through the toxic waste of unedited self-importance. You closed the document quickly, the moment tainted by the sheer terror that you might accidentally see one of your own students Write a sentence about a visceral sexual kale. When Arthur came home, you couldn't look him in the eye without a nervous giggle escaping. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice calm and composed, as if he hadn't just spent 8 hours trying to save a celebrity chef from his own internal monologue. "Wonderful," you said, pouring him a drink. "I taught the children that every sentence needs a subject and a predicate, a non-negotiable truth." You didn't mention the kale. You later watched Arthur work, his fingers flying across the keys, turning monumental vision into a commitment to quality that required years of dedication and sacrifice. You understood now. Your boring love story wasn't about two artists struggling. It was about two highly dedicated professionals, one of whom taught the rules of grammar and the other who was paid generously to strategically break them without ever getting caught. And you were the only one who knew the depth of the deception. Your accidental exposure to the chef's first attempt, that magnificent monument to the abuse of capital letters, didn't just reveal the scale of Arthur's cleanup operation. It gave you a peek behind the curtain at the ghostwriter's tools. You began to notice his specific professional tricks, the techniques that allowed him to be so brilliant and so utterly invisible. It was like living with a magician and finally learning the mechanics of the scarf trick. Arthur, you realized, was a master of imitation and strategic invisibility. His entire process was a highly specialized, repetitive act of linguistic ventriloquism. He didn't just write like his clients, he absorbed their voice, their cadence, and most importantly, their unique flaws, which he then polished just enough to make them palatable. You started categorizing his tricks. First, there was the tragic flaw conversion. If a client had a major visible character flaw, say crippling indecision or a tendency to aggressively overspend, Arthur would convert it into a strategic pause or a bold investment in future growth. He never removed the flaw entirely. He simply renamed it and draped it in the comfortable language of self-help. You saw him do this when he changed a tech CEO's admitted panic attack over a coding error into a moment of profound clarity regarding resource allocation. You joked with him that he should teach a seminar on it, turning your existential crisis into a key business takeaway. Second, he was a genius with the filler word. You, the school teacher, taught the importance of concrete nouns and active verbs. Arthur taught his clients the supreme power of words like leverage, synergy, holistic, and paradigm. These words, you realized, were ghostwriting duct tape. They sounded intelligent, masked any lack of substance, and crucially, were impossible to fact check. They were placeholders for actual thought, a way to deliver 500 words of persuasive content when the client only provided 50 words of actual information. You often caught him practicing his craft in the living room. He'd be watching a terrible reality show or a tedious financial news program, his noise-canceling headphones off, and he'd mimic the speech patterns of the host or the interviewee under his breath. He was practicing the art of imitation, training his ear to replicate the precise sound of unearned confidence. He was turning himself into an empty vessel, ready to be filled with someone else's, often mediocre thoughts. You asked him about it one evening. "Do you ever worry," you murmured, "that you'll forget your own voice?" He looked up from his screen where he was currently replacing the word sad with a deep sense of untapped potential for a social media guru's post. "I don't forget it," he replied calmly. "I just keep it in a lockbox. My voice is too boring, too subtle to sell books. People want the high impact, low substance tone of my clients. My job is to perfect the sound of their brand, not my own soul. It's actually quite restful being invisible." You realized his invisibility was not a side effect of the job. It was the core skill. While you dedicated your days to making your students visible, articulate, and grammatically correct, Arthur dedicated his days to making his clients sound like themselves, only smarter, more profound, and utterly unlike the awful first drafts he started with. The true genius of the ghostwriter was the complete and total erasure of the self, and you loved him for it, realizing that his quiet, competent camouflage was the perfect shield for your often loud, demanding life. The quiet brilliance of Arthur's invisibility was the foundation of your marriage, but it constantly presented low-grade social challenges. The core issue wasn't the ghostwriting itself, but the lie's weight, the low-level social pressure stemming from your friends' persistent, well-meaning inquiries about Arthur's imaginary literary career. You, the school teacher, thrived on transparency. Arthur, the ghostwriter, lived and breathed non-disclosure. Your teaching colleagues, your close friends, and especially your well-meaning mother, all believed Arthur was in the final stages of a critically important, highly secretive novel. This belief was entirely fueled by Arthur's vague updates, the kind he'd practiced on the tech CEO about wrestling with the narrative structure. Every gathering, every casual phone call included the inevitable check-in. "How's Arthur's book coming along?" You had developed a repertoire of evasive but still plausible responses. You had 3 categories, depending on the inquisitor. 1, the serious educator. Friend, he's deep in the trenches of character development. It's a profound exploration of postmodern malaise, very dense. It's slow going, the weight of the themes. This satisfied anyone who thought slow writing equaled good writing. 2, the casual acquaintance. The publishers being very protective of the IP. It's under strict embargo until the official announcement. It's looking like a huge fall release. This satisfied anyone who understood corporate jargon and respected secrecy. 3, your mother. He's still trying to figure out how to make his protagonist happier. It's emotionally draining. He just needs time and a lot of soup. This satisfied anyone who believes all writers are simultaneously depressed and malnourished. The tension wasn't that you were actively deceiving people. It was that you were constantly managing a fictional public narrative while also managing a very real, very mundane private one. One evening, your best friend from the faculty called, genuinely concerned. "He sounds so stressed. Is he okay?" The pressure to produce a masterpiece must be immense. You had to restrain yourself from laughing hysterically, knowing that Arthur's stress that week stemmed entirely from the client, a popular pet photographer, insisting that her book on finding your inner golden retriever needed a full chapter on her spiritual connection to artisanal oat milk. You realize that Arthur, the master of invisible language, was also the master of making his work sound simultaneously profound and impossible to question. He had created an aura of unattainable literary genius that functioned as the perfect social shield. He never had to show anyone a manuscript, never had to defend a plot point, and never had to admit he spent his morning arguing about whether the word nourishing was more effective than sustaining in a section about organic kale chips. You look at him across the dinner table where he is calmly explaining the concept of the conditional tense to you, after you mixed up would and could in a sentence. A true teacher's pet moment for him. You realize the true weight of the lie isn't the fear of exposure, but the energy expended on maintenance. You, the teacher who requires verifiable truth, are now a professional participant in a long-running, low-stakes psychological operation. And you wouldn't trade it for anything. You often think, if he can make a tech CEO sound like a philosopher, maintaining the illusion of his own novel is just a light side project. The beautiful, boring symbiosis of your lives, one of visible structure, one of invisible prose, found its ultimate absurd expression when Arthur, the master of the non-disclosure agreement and the strategic euphemism, volunteered for the most mundane, transparently public duty imaginable, the PTA meeting. You had casually mentioned needing a second body to take minutes for the monthly Parent-Teacher Association meeting, a notoriously dull affair, where the main debate usually revolved around the correct brand of paper towels for the faculty lounge. Arthur, perhaps feeling a pang of marital guilt over his invisible career, agreed to attend. This was a fascinating collision of worlds. The ghostwriter, whose daily task was crafting elegant, highly paid deception, was now tasked with recording the unvarnished, often clumsy truth of a local school bureaucracy. You sit beside him in the small fluorescent-lit auditorium, passing him a school-issue spiral notebook and a slightly chipped pen. The meeting starts, and it is, predictably, agonizingly slow. The treasurer reads an exhaustive report on the popcorn machine fundraiser, followed by a protracted, circular debate about whether the new playground equipment should be red or blue. You glance at Arthur. He has put on his ghostwriter face. That expression of detached, intense focus he usually reserves for translating a politician's rambling speech into a 5-point action-oriented manifesto. He isn't just taking notes. He is writing the dull meeting minutes verbatim, with a level of accuracy and dedication that you, the regular minute taker, have long since abandoned in favor of summarizing with phrases like protracted discussion on color choice, tabled. Arthur is recording every single inane detail. He captures the subtle differences in inflection when Mrs. Henderson asks about the budget for field trips versus when she asks about the budget for the annual teacher appreciation lunch. You can almost see him assigning a voice profile to the PTA president. He is applying the full, formidable force of his linguistic training, the same skills he uses to make CEOS sound profound, to the meticulous, uncompensated recording of neighborhood gossip and petty budget squabbles. During a particularly slow moment where two parents engage in a passive-aggressive battle over the recycling program, Arthur leans over and whispers to you, his eyes still locked on the speaker. "The subtext here," he murmurs, sounding like a literary critic dissecting Moby Dick, is an underlying power struggle for control of the annual Spring Fair Organizing Committee. Note the repeated use of the phrase best practices to establish dominance. You almost snort with laughter. He has turned a tedious PTA meeting into a covert political drama. He is so good at observing and recording the minutiae of human interaction that he can't simply not do it, even when the subject is paper towels. When the meeting finally ends, Arthur's notebook is filled with pages of immaculate, perfectly structured, yet utterly boring prose. The final minutes, when typed up and distributed, are the clearest, most accurate minutes the PTA has ever received. They are a work of art, a beautiful, boring testament to his skill. The president is ecstatic, praising his unparalleled clarity and attention to detail. As you walk home, you joke with him. See? If your novel fails, you can always ghostwrite PTA minutes for a living. You make bureaucratic boredom sing. He smiles, adjusting his glasses. The challenge, my dear, is making someone else's mundane sound profound. And honestly, the recycling debate had a surprisingly compelling narrative arc. I only had to change "I think we should" to "we must strategically implement." And you realize your life is complete. You married a man who can find profound purpose in a PTA meeting and is now using his invisible talent to better your very visible, very real world. The PTA meeting was the final, triumphant confirmation that Arthur's ghostwriting skills, while built on a beautiful deception, were profoundly useful in the real, structured world of your schoolteacher life. The PTA president still raves about the clarity of the minutes. This was the steady, comfortable life you had built, until one rainy Tuesday evening, when the quiet, comfortable lie finally required a dose of pure, unadorned truth, leading to the confession. You were in the living room, grading spelling tests, the scent of damp wool and old paper filling the air. Arthur was, predictably, on the couch beside you, ostensibly reading, but actually skimming a newly published corporate biography, assessing the ghostwriter's technique. The rain outside was relentless, providing the perfect moody backdrop for a minor emotional reckoning. You hadn't pressed him on the novel in months, having long since moved past the idea of him being a brooding literary genius. You knew the truth of his work, or at least the mechanics of it, but you still had to maintain the public facade, and the fatigue of that performance finally got to you. You put down your red pen, the abrupt silence surprising both of you. "My mother called today," you said, your voice soft against the rain. "She asked if you had started the first round of edits on your manuscript yet. I told her you were wrestling with the protagonist's moral ambiguity." Arthur sighed, a deep, tired sound that sounded less like the sigh of a struggling novelist and more like the sigh of a man who just spent 8 hours turning a CEO's aggressive expansion strategy into a philosophy about courageous growth. He placed his book down, its glossy cover reflecting the dim light. "It's getting heavy, isn't it?" he asked, not a question, but an acknowledgement of the social performance you both maintained. "A little," you admitted. "Mostly just exhausting to maintain the mystery. My colleagues are starting to suspect your novel is actually a highly sophisticated piece of performance art." Arthur turned to you fully, the faint glow of the lamp catching his glasses. "I'm not working on a novel," he said, the words clean, direct, and entirely without fanfare. This was the first time he had fully and unambiguously confessed the complete truth, without the safety net of vagueness or euphemism. "I am a professional ghostwriter. Every word I publish belongs to someone else. I am a highly skilled, contractually invisible laborer." He didn't make excuses. He just stated the fact of his profession. He admitted to the reality of the absurdity, the corporate white papers, the motivational speaking ebooks, the aggressive avoidance of his own identity. He explained the NDAs, the client list, and the surprisingly high rate he charged for his linguistic invisibility. He even admitted that the existential dread he sometimes referenced was actually the stress of trying to make a fermented foods entrepreneur sound like a Zen master. You felt a huge surge of relief. The air immediately felt lighter, cleaner, like the oppressive heat of Lugano. finally giving way to cool, unvarnished truth. "I know," you replied, surprising both him and yourself. "I accidentally read the chef's truly magnificent first draft, the one about the sexual kale." Arthur blinked once, the realization of your quiet knowledge dawning on him. He then burst out laughing, a genuine, uncontrolled sound of relief that immediately diffused all the tension. "Oh God," he managed between gasps. "The kale?" "I spent 2 full days trying to substitute visceral, almost sexual, with a professional term. I settled on the deeply satisfying textural complexity. It still feels like a failure. When the meeting finally ends, Arthur's notebook is filled with pages of immaculate, perfectly structured, yet utterly boring prose. The final minutes, when typed up and distributed, are the clearest, most accurate minutes the PTA has ever received. They are a work of art, a beautiful, boring testament to his skill. The president is ecstatic, praising his unparalleled clarity and attention to detail. As you walk home, you joke with him. "See? If your novel fails, you can always ghostwrite PTA minutes for a living. You make bureaucratic boredom sing." He smiles, adjusting his glasses. "The challenge, my dear, is making someone else's mundane sound profound. And honestly, the recycling debate had a surprisingly compelling narrative arc. I only had to change 'I think we should' to 'we must strategically implement.' And you realize your life is complete. You married a man who can find profound purpose in a PTA meeting and is now using his invisible talent to better your very visible, very real world." The PTA meeting was the final, triumphant confirmation that Arthur's ghostwriting skills, while built on a beautiful deception, were profoundly useful in the real, structured world of your schoolteacher life. The PTA president still raves about the clarity of the minutes. This was the steady, comfortable life you had built, until one rainy Tuesday evening, when the quiet, comfortable lie finally required a dose of pure, unadorned truth, leading to the confession. You were in the living room, grading spelling tests, the scent of damp wool and old paper filling the air. Arthur was, predictably, on the couch beside you, ostensibly reading, but actually skimming a newly published corporate biography, assessing the ghostwriter's technique. The rain outside was relentless, providing the perfect moody backdrop for a minor emotional reckoning. You hadn't pressed him on the novel in months, having long since moved past the idea of him being a brooding literary genius. You knew the truth of his work, or at least the mechanics of it, but you still had to maintain the public facade, and the fatigue of that performance finally got to you. You put down your red pen, the abrupt silence surprising both of you. "My mother called today," you said, your voice soft against the rain. "She asked if you had started the first round of edits on your manuscript yet. I told her you were wrestling with the protagonist's moral ambiguity." Arthur sighed, a deep, tired sound that sounded less like the sigh of a struggling novelist and more like the sigh of a man who just spent 8 hours turning a CEO's aggressive expansion strategy into a philosophy about courageous growth. He placed his book down, its glossy cover reflecting the dim light. "It's getting heavy, isn't it?" he asked, not a question, but an acknowledgement of the social performance you both maintained. "A little," you admitted. "Mostly just exhausting to maintain the mystery. My colleagues are starting to suspect your novel is actually a highly sophisticated piece of performance art." Arthur turned to you fully, the faint glow of the lamp catching his glasses. "I'm not working on a novel," he said, the words clean, direct, and entirely without fanfare. This was the first time he had fully and unambiguously confessed the complete truth, without the safety net of vagueness or euphemism. I am a professional ghostwriter. Every word I publish belongs to someone else. I am a highly skilled, contractually invisible laborer. He didn't make excuses. He just stated the fact of his profession. He admitted to the reality of the absurdity, the corporate white papers, the motivational speaking ebooks, the aggressive avoidance of his own identity. He explained the NDAs, the client list, and the surprisingly high rate he charged for his linguistic invisibility. He even admitted that the existential dread he sometimes referenced was actually the stress of trying to make a fermented foods entrepreneur sound like a Zen master. You felt a huge surge of relief. The air immediately felt lighter, cleaner, like the oppressive heat of Lugano, finally giving way to cool, unvarnished truth. I know, you replied, surprising both him and yourself. I accidentally read the chef's truly magnificent first draft, the one about the sexual kale. Arthur blinked once, the realization of your quiet knowledge dawning on him. He then burst out laughing, a genuine, uncontrolled sound of relief that immediately diffused all the tension. Oh God, he managed between gasps. The kale? I spent 2 full days trying to substitute visceral, almost sexual, with a professional term. I settled on the deeply satisfying textural complexity. It still feels like a failure. The honesty was liberating. The quiet, unexpected revelation on a rainy Tuesday evening was the most profoundly connecting moment of your marriage, not because it was shocking, but because it finally brought your internal truths into shared physical reality. You didn't marry a struggling novelist. You married a highly competent, brilliantly invisible literary assassin. And knowing that fully and completely was far more satisfying than any fictional masterpiece. The confession, the shared laughter over the absurd depths of the chef's kale-related prose, didn't destabilize your marriage, it strengthened it. The lie was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet understanding. This led to the stage of acceptance, where you realized that Arthur's invisible skill actually complemented your own highly visible, structured life in a perfectly balanced, boring way. You, the school teacher, thrived on structure, verification, and transparency. Your life required rules. The rules of grammar, the rules of the curriculum, the rules of classroom management. Your profession was about making things seen, understood, and correct. If a child didn't grasp the concept of photosynthesis, you simply had to explain it more clearly until the truth was absorbed. Arthur, the ghostwriter, thrived on flexibility, invention, and strategic invisibility. His profession was about taking amorphous, often chaotic ideas and making them sound authoritative, persuasive, and most importantly, not his own. He was the anti-teacher, a master of making the subjective appear objective and the shallow seem deep. The great realization was that your careers, though polar opposites, made your domestic life run with clockwork precision. Your structure provided the framework for his flexibility. You handled the visible public demands, the PTA, the parent-teacher conferences, the social performance of a happy couple, while he handled the invisible digital economy that paid the bulk of the bills. You now see the genius in his work not as a deception, but as a high-level logistical talent. He wasn't just writing, he was performing a psychological service, giving confidence to people who had achieved massive success but lacked a cohesive narrative. He was an emotional tailor, measuring their insecurity and crafting a suit of linguistic authority that fit perfectly. You often watch him now with your full, knowing acceptance. He'll be meticulously editing a memoir for a social media influencer, removing every like and totally to make them sound more like a thought leader. You'll lean against the doorframe, sipping your tea, perfectly hot, no longer lukewarm, and say, "How are the thought leader's strategic pauses coming along?" He'll look up, grin, and reply, "I just successfully turned his massive panic debt into a chapter on the courageous restructuring of personal finance." It was an act of linguistic alchemy. You realize that his quiet, competent camouflage is the perfect counterweight to your very loud, very exposed existence. You come home exhausted from managing the sheer volume of 40 children. He comes home mentally drained from having to contain his own personality for 8 hours. You need him to be quiet and structured. He needs you to be loud and real. The biggest relief is the shared laughter. You can now talk openly about the absurdities of the self-help industry, the ego-driven demands of his clients, and the sheer volume of filler words he has to employ. You can finally joke about the existential dread of ergonomic office chairs and the visceral qualities of fermented cabbage. This shared professional sarcasm is a bond stronger than any romantic fantasy. You married a man who can make the price of artisanal oat milk sound like a spiritual journey, and you are entirely comfortable being the anchor that grounds him in the simple, verifiable truth of fourth grade math. The boring love story is not the absence of drama, but the perfect fit of two functional components that on paper should never have worked. The years pass with the comfortable, predictable rhythm of a life built on a solid foundation of structure and professional invisibility. You, the school teacher, continue your visible work, marking papers, managing the noise, and guiding young minds toward the non-negotiable truths of grammar and arithmetic. Arthur, the ghostwriter, continues his invisible work, crafting narratives for people who, frankly, have nothing much to say, but require 80,000 polished words to say it. This is the new normal, and you find peace in your perfectly mismatched, boring life. You realize that Arthur's ghostwriting isn't a moral failing. It's a profound, specialized skill that perfectly insulates your home life. You are the only person who knows that the latest, highly acclaimed self-help book on finding inner resilience through strategic budgeting was written entirely by your husband while wearing sweatpants and arguing with you about which of your two cats deserves the fanciest brand of wet food. This shared secret is the glue. The irony never fully fades, but it sweetens into a comfortable inside joke. You occasionally help him brainstorm euphemisms for corporate layoffs. Your favorite suggestion was a courageous streamlining of human capital to optimize resource allocation. And he proofreads your lesson plans, often suggesting minor structural improvements that make the learning objectives alarmingly clear. The PTA minutes, thanks to his initial obsessive intervention, remain the gold standard, a testament to the power of a ghostwriter applying his full talent to the most mundane of tasks. The persistent queries from friends about Arthur's imaginary novel have finally subsided, replaced by a quiet, shared acceptance that he is simply a very busy, very philosophical consultant who speaks in vague corporate platitudes. You've both perfected the art of non-commitment when discussing his career, a skill set that is now invaluable for navigating any challenging social situation. You no longer feel the heavy weight of the lie because the truth that you married a man who is paid to be linguistically absent is more interesting and far more loving than any fictional narrative. You look around your home, a space filled with the comfortable clutter of your structured life and the quiet professional tools of his invisible one. On your side of the desk are stacks of meticulously corrected papers and brightly colored markers. On his side is a silent laptop and a meticulously organized file system. The dichotomy is beautiful. You are the lighthouse, visible and fixed. He is the submarine, expertly navigating the currents just beneath the surface. You both achieve success through structure, yours visible, his concealed. The boring love story, you conclude, isn't about two halves completing a whole. It's about two perfectly mismatched pieces that, when placed together, create a highly functional, entirely comfortable life. You are the truth teller, and he is the professional illusionist. You are the noise, and he is the silence. You realize that your life is perfectly balanced, perfectly undramatic, and perfectly boringly wonderful. The light in the room softens, fading into the gentle gray of early evening. You feel the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, the residual hum of the school corridor slowly quieting. You close your eyes, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of Arthur's typing in the next room, the quiet, steady tap, tap, tap of a man meticulously crafting someone else's great success, completely content with his own invisibility. The scent of old paper and the quiet click of the keyboard are the only sounds now, a simple, perfect melody of domestic peace. You drift, knowing that the man you married by mistake is actually the only man you could have ever married.